The Chicago skyline cut a jagged silhouette against the pale morning sky as Richard Montgomery's Italian leather shoes clicked across the marble floor of his penthouse. The floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the city like a living painting, his city, or so it sometimes felt. At 42, Richard had built Vertex Technologies into a billion-dollar empire through cold calculation and relentless ambition. This morning, like most mornings, he stood at the edge of his glass kingdom, coffee untouched, watching the world below with detached curiosity. The steam from his cup rose and disappeared against the window, much like the connections in his life, present for a moment, then gone without a trace. His smartphone vibrated. Another message from the household staffing agency. His fourth housekeeper in 3 months was quitting. Richard sighed, his reflection in the glass showing the slight tightening around his eyes, the only visible indication of his frustration. He couldn't understand why keeping staff was so difficult. He paid well. He was rarely home. He required nothing but competence and discretion. The doorbell chimed precisely at 8 o'clock. The new housekeeper had arrived. Richard straightened his already perfect tie and walked to the door with measured steps. He opened it to find a woman in her early 30s, dressed simply but neatly, her dark hair pulled back into a practical bun. What struck him wasn't her appearance, but her eyes, deep, brown and somehow both tired and alert, like someone who had seen too much but refused to look away. "Mr. Montgomery, I'm Eleanor Wilson, the agency sent me." Her voice was quiet but clear, with a dignity that seemed at odds with her worn hands. Richard nodded, gesturing her inside. "Yes. Come in. I hope you'll last longer than your predecessors." Eleanor's expression didn't change as she followed him into the gleaming space. She simply nodded and said, "I intend to do my job well, sir." As Richard showed her around, listing his expectations with clinical precision, he noticed how she absorbed every detail without comment. No excessive smiling, no unnecessary chatter, just quiet competence. Perfect, he thought. Invisible, just the way he preferred. What he couldn't know was how that invisibility was about to shatter his carefully constructed world. Over the next 2 weeks, Eleanor became a silent presence in Richard's home. His shirts appeared perfectly pressed, meals materialized at exact times, everything gleamed. Yet she herself remained a shadow, disappearing promptly at 6 each evening, regardless of what remained to be done. When he asked about overtime, she declined politely but firmly. "I have prior commitments, Mr. Montgomery." Richard found himself wondering about those commitments with growing curiosity. Eleanor was unlike anyone he'd employed before, efficient, yet somehow distant, as though physically present but mentally elsewhere. He began to notice small details. How she saved food scraps in containers, how she carefully collected the barely used hotel soaps and shampoos from his business trips, how she sometimes looked out at the skyline with an expression he couldn't decipher. One evening, standing at his window while Eleanor quietly cleaned the kitchen, Richard watched her reflection. Her movements were precise, economical, but when she thought herself unobserved, a profound weariness seemed to settle over her like a heavy cloak. Something about that momentary vulnerability triggered a memory. His mother, exhausted after working double shifts, trying to hide her fatigue from him as a child. The thought came unbidden. Where does she go every evening in such a hurry? If you are enjoying the story, type 5 in the comments and subscribe for more videos like this. If not, type 0. It helps me create even better content for you. Continuing. The question lingered in Richard's mind for days, an irritating splinter he couldn't extract. Eleanor remained the perfect employee, diligent, thorough, and completely closed off. She arrived each morning at precisely 8 and left each evening at exactly 6 like clockwork. The mystery of her life beyond his penthouse walls grew more intriguing with each passing day. One particularly dreary Thursday, Richard found himself staring at the clock as it approached 6. He hadn't planned it, not consciously at least, but he found himself reaching for his coat when Eleanor gathered her things to leave. "Heading out, Mr. Montgomery?" she asked, surprise briefly, flickering across her face. "Meeting downtown?" He lied smoothly, picking up his keys. "Have a good evening, Eleanor." He waited in the lobby until she emerged, then followed her at a discreet distance. It felt absurd, a billionaire CEO trailing his housekeeper through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, yet he couldn't stop himself. Eleanor boarded the L train heading south, standing quietly among the evening commuters. Richard followed, keeping his distance, feeling increasingly foolish yet driven by an unexplainable compulsion. At the south side, she transferred to a bus that wound through neighborhoods that grew progressively more run down. Finally, after nearly an hour of travel, she disembarked in an area Richard barely recognized as part of his city, dilapidated. Buildings, crumbling infrastructure, signs of deep-rooted poverty everywhere. Eleanor walked briskly through streets where suspicious eyes followed her progress. She moved with purpose, clearly familiar with the route, until she reached a small apartment building with peeling paint and a security door hanging loosely on its hinges. Richard watched from across the street as she climbed to the third floor and unlocked a door. When the door opened, the transformation was immediate and stunning. "Aunt Ellie!" Two small voices cried out in unison, and two small bodies launched themselves into Eleanor's arms. She dropped to her knees, embracing the children, girls perhaps 7 and 9 years old, with such fierce tenderness that Richard felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. "Did you behave for Mrs. Guzman?" Eleanor asked, her voice warmer and more animated than Richard had ever heard it. "Yes, I finished my math homework, and Jenny drew a picture for you," the younger girl exclaimed. "Let me see it after dinner," Eleanor smiled, rising to her feet. "I brought something special tonight." From her bag, she produced a small roast chicken, clearly a luxury item that Richard realized must have come from his own refrigerator, leftovers he would have discarded without thought. What has he stumbled upon? Who were these children? Why had Eleanor never mentioned them? What Richard couldn't have known was that the humble apartment he was observing held more true wealth than his penthouse ever would. But soon, the full, devastating truth would change everything, for all of them. Eleanor's apartment was a study in dignified poverty. Through the window, Richard could see a space barely larger than his walk-in closet, meticulously organized to accommodate 3 lives. A fold-out couch dominated one wall, a small table with mismatched chairs another. School papers hung proudly on the refrigerator. A narrow hallway presumably led to a single bedroom where Richard suspected the girls slept, while Eleanor took the couch. As he watched, Eleanor served the chicken, giving the largest portions to the children while taking only a small piece for herself. They ate together, laughing and talking with an intimacy that made Richard's chest tighten. When was the last time he'd shared a meal like that with anyone? Had he ever? He should leave. This was a violation of Eleanor's privacy, of basic decency. Yet he remained rooted to the spot, a voyeur to a life so different from his own that it might as well have been happening on another planet. Later, as darkness fell, Richard watched Eleanor help the girls with homework, her patience seemingly infinite despite the exhaustion evident in the slope of her shoulders. Then came bedtime rituals, teeth brushing, stories, prayers. "Is Mommy watching us from heaven, Aunt Ellie?" the younger girl asked. Eleanor's voice carried faintly through the window. "Of course she is, Sophie. She loves you both so much." "Do you think she's proud of us?" "I know she is. She's so proud of her brave, smart girls." Richard finally turned away, a strange hollowness expanding in his chest. He made his way back to the main street, hailed a taxi, and returned to his sterile penthouse, seeing it with new eyes. The space that had once seemed the pinnacle of success now felt empty, meaningless. That night, sleep eluded him. Images of Eleanor and the girls haunted him. Their simple dinner, their laughter, their prayers. Something had been awakened in him, something he'd buried long ago. The next morning, Eleanor arrived as usual, showing no sign that anything was different. But Richard knew everything had changed. He found himself watching her work, seeing not just an employee, but a woman carrying an enormous burden with quiet dignity. "Eleanor," he said finally, breaking the customary silence, "is everything all right? You seem tired today." She looked up, surprise evident in her eyes. "I'm fine, Mr. Montgomery. Thank you for asking." The conversation might have ended there, but Richard persisted. "I've noticed you never take overtime. Most housekeepers in this building do. Eleanor hesitated. I have responsibilities at home. Family? Another pause. Yes. My nieces. What will Richard do with this knowledge? And what dark secret connects their lives in ways neither could imagine? The truth, when revealed, will devastate them both. At the executive offices of Vertex Technologies, Richard sat through a budget meeting, his mind elsewhere. For the first time in years, he found himself distracted, unable to focus on the financial projections displayed on the screen. Instead, he saw Eleanor's nieces, their faces lit with joy at their aunt's return. Richard, your thoughts on the Davis acquisition? His CFO's voice broke through his reverie. I need more information, he managed, shuffling papers he hadn't read. Schedule a follow-up next week. As the room cleared, his assistant handed him a folder. The background checks on all household staff you requested last month. Security just delivered them. Richard had forgotten ordering these, a standard procedure for anyone with access to his home. He opened the folder absently, flipping through until he reached Eleanor's file. What he read stopped his heart. Eleanor Wilson, née Pearson. Sister. To Catherine Pearson, deceased 3 years prior. Cause of death, vehicular manslaughter by an intoxicated driver. The driver identified as James Harrington, Vice President of Operations at Vertex Technologies. Richard's blood turned to ice. Harrington, his VP, his friend of 15 years, had killed Eleanor's sister and left 2 children motherless. Reading further, his horror deepened. The case had been settled quietly, the company's legal team minimizing damages and publicity. Richard's own signature was on the authorization for the settlement. He had unknowingly protected the man who destroyed Eleanor's family. The revelation left him physically ill. He cancelled his remaining meetings and drove home in a daze, arriving just as Eleanor was preparing to leave. Mr. Montgomery, she said, surprised to see him so early. I've finished everything except— Eleanor, he interrupted, his voice unsteady. Please sit down, I need to talk to you. Confusion crossed her face, but she complied, perching on the edge of a chair. Richard struggled to find words, his throat tight. How long have your nieces lived with you? He finally asked. Her posture stiffened. 3 years since my sister passed. Catherine, Richard said softly. Eleanor's eyes widened. How do you— I know about the accident, Eleanor. I know about Harrington. The words felt like glass in his mouth. What I didn't know until today was that he works for me, that my company helped cover it up. The color drained from Eleanor's face. For a moment she sat perfectly still, as if carved from stone. Then she stood, gathering her bag with trembling hands. I need to go, she whispered. Please. Richard reached out, not touching her but blocking her path. Let me explain. Explain what? Her voice was barely audible. That you protected the man who killed my sister. That your money made sure he spent 3 months in jail instead of years. That you're the reason Sophie and Jenny cry for their mother every night. Have you ever known someone who had to rebuild their life after a devastating loss? A single brief sentence asking you to answer this question by commenting in the comments. Richard's world collapsed around him. Everything he'd built, every success he'd achieved, suddenly seemed hollow in the face of Eleanor's quiet devastation. The worst part was that she was right. His company, his policies, his signature had contributed to this injustice. I didn't. No, he said, the words painfully inadequate. I signed dozens of legal settlements every month. I should have paid attention. Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him for perhaps the first time. And would it have mattered if you had? Would you have done anything differently? The question hit him like a physical blow. 3 years ago, would he have cared about a woman he'd never met, about 2 little girls left without a mother? He wanted to say yes, but the truth was he didn't know. I want to make it right, he said finally. Whatever that looks like, whatever you need. Eleanor shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. You can't make it right, Mr. Montgomery. No one can. She left, and Richard didn't try to stop her. He knew she wouldn't return. Why would she? He spent the night pacing his penthouse, haunted by the knowledge that he had been complicit in her suffering. By morning he had made a decision. Richard called an emergency board meeting. Without preamble, he laid out what had happened: Harrington's crime, the company's cover-up, his own failure of oversight. The board members sat in stunned silence. "I'm reopening the case," Richard announced. "Full compensation to the family, no limits, and Harrington is finished at Vertex today." "You can't be serious," one board member protested. "The legal implications alone—" "I don't care," Richard cut him off. "This isn't about legal implications, it's about what's right." The battle that followed threatened everything Richard had built. Harrington fought back, threatening to expose company secrets. Shareholders wavered. Stock prices dipped. But Richard remained resolute, driven by the memory of Eleanor's face when she learned the truth. Meanwhile, Eleanor struggled to explain to Sophie and Jenny why she'd left her job. The loss of income meant immediate hardship. No money for new school shoes, no funds for the medication Jenny needed for her asthma. Eleanor took on a second job, cleaning offices at night after the girls were asleep, leaving them with Mrs. Guzman, their elderly neighbor. Richard tried to find Eleanor, to tell her what he was doing, but she had disappeared from the agency's roster. Weeks passed as he fought battles on multiple fronts: legal, financial, personal. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for something beyond profit margins and market share. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. A letter arrived at his office, unsigned but clearly from Eleanor. "The girls need their asthma medication. I can't afford it anymore. If you truly want to help, this is how." Attached was a prescription and a pharmacy address. Is Richard too late to make amends? Or could this gesture be the beginning of a redemption neither of them thought possible? Richard didn't hesitate. He personally went to the pharmacy, paid for a year's supply of medication, and arranged for regular refills. Then he waited, sitting on a bench across the street, uncertain if Eleanor would appear. When she finally came, the sight of her nearly broke him. In just 3 weeks she seemed to have aged years. Dark circles underlined her eyes, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. When the pharmacist handed her the medication, explaining it had been paid for, Richard watched her shoulders sag, not with relief but with something like resignation. He approached her outside, keeping a respectful distance. "Eleanor?" She turned, unsurprised to see him. "Mr. Montgomery." "Richard, please." He gestured to the bench. 5 minutes, that's all I ask." Reluctantly, she sat. Richard remained, standing, unable to find the right posture, the right words. "Harrington is gone," he began. "I've reopened the case against him, personally and corporately. And I've dedicated a fund for your nieces, for education, healthcare, whatever they need." Eleanor stared at her hands. "Why are you doing this?" It was the question Richard had been asking himself for weeks. "Because it's right," he said, simply. "And because seeing you, seeing your family, it reminded me of something I lost a long time ago." For the first time, he told someone about his own childhood, his single mother who had worked herself to death, trying to give him opportunities, the coldness he had cultivated to succeed in a world that had no mercy for sentimentality. "I became the thing I hated," he admitted, "and I never even realized it until I saw you with those girls." Eleanor remained silent, but something in her eyes had shifted. "I can't bring your sister back," Richard said. "I can't undo what Harrington did, or my part in protecting him. But I can try to make sure those girls have the future your sister would have wanted for them. They don't need charity," Eleanor said quietly. "They need their mother." "I know." Richard finally sat beside her. "But maybe they also need to see that the world isn't always cruel, that sometimes people try to make things right." The tension between them remained, a gulf of grief and responsibility neither could fully bridge. But as Eleanor rose to leave, she paused. "Sophie has a school play next Friday," she said, not looking at him. "She's playing a tree, if you wanted to see what your fund is supporting." It was the smallest of openings, but to Richard it felt like redemption. The elementary school auditorium was nothing like the venues Richard usually frequented. Folding chairs, construction paper decorations, the smell of industrial cleaner barely masking years of sneakers and cafeteria food. He sat awkwardly in the back, feeling conspicuously out of place in his tailored suit. When Sophie appeared on stage, a tiny girl in a homemade tree costume, her face alight with the importance of her role, Richard felt an unexpected tightness in his throat. He watched both girls that evening, Sophie on stage and Jenny in the audience leaning forward in her seat, mouthing her sister's lines as if she'd helped her practice. Afterward, in the crowded hallway, the girls spotted him before Eleanor did. "You're Mr. Montgomery," Jenny exclaimed. "Aunt Ellie told us you're helping with my medicine." Richard knelt to their level, something he couldn't remember ever doing before. "You can call me Richard, and your sister was an excellent tree." Sophie beamed. "Did you hear my line? I had the most important one. About protecting the forest, you delivered it perfectly." Eleanor watched this exchange with complex emotions visible in her eyes. Caution, confusion, and something softer Richard couldn't identify. That evening marked the beginning of a delicate new arrangement. Richard didn't try to buy forgiveness with grand gestures. Instead, he simply showed up, for school events, for Sunday afternoons in the park, for quiet conversations with Eleanor after the girls were asleep. He learned about Catherine through her daughters and her sister, gradually, piecing together the life of the woman his company had failed. The walls Eleanor had built began to slowly lower. Not all at once and not completely, but enough that Richard caught glimpses of the woman beneath the grief, intelligent, wickedly funny at times, fiercely protective, capable of a warmth that made his penthouse seem colder than ever by comparison. For his part, Richard changed in ways that surprised even himself. He delegated more at work to spend afternoons helping with homework. He learned to make simple meals that the girls would eat. He discovered that his business acumen could be useful in negotiating with Sophie's teacher about a poor grade or figuring out the most cost-effective way to repair Eleanor's ancient refrigerator. 6 months after that first school play, Richard arrived at Eleanor's apartment to find her sitting on the steps, face in her hands. "What's wrong? Are the girls okay?" he asked, immediately alarmed. Eleanor looked up, her eyes red. "The building's been sold. We have 30 days to find a new place, but rents have skyrocketed in this neighborhood. I don't know where we'll go." Richard's immediate instinct was to solve the problem with money, buy the building, pay her rent elsewhere, offer his guest rooms. But he had learned that Eleanor's pride was part of what made her strong for the girls. So instead, he sat beside her on the cold step. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. "Together." That single word, together, hung between them, heavy with possibility. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Together," she agreed. Could this unexpected partnership heal wounds that run so deep, or will the shadows of the past continue to separate them, even as their lives become increasingly intertwined? The weeks that followed brought Richard deeper into the daily realities of Eleanor's life. Together, they scoured rental listings, visited apartments in neighborhoods he'd never set foot in before, calculated tight budgets that had to accommodate everything from school supplies to growing feet that constantly needed new shoes. Richard had never worked harder on anything, and he'd certainly never cared so much about the outcome. When they finally found a small but clean 2-bedroom apartment within walking distance of the girls' school, he felt a pride that surpassed any business deal he'd ever closed. On moving day, Richard arrived in jeans and a t-shirt, clothing he'd had to purchase specially for the occasion. Eleanor did a double take. "I almost didn't recognize you," she said, the hint of a smile playing at her lips. "Good different or bad different?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. "Just different." But her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than necessary. The move was accomplished with a rented truck, the help of Mrs. Guzman's teenage sons, and more physical labor than Richard had done in decades. By evening, when the girls were asleep in their new room, a real bedroom they would share with walls Eleanor had let them help paint yellow, Richard and Eleanor sat exhausted on the floor of the small living room, sharing a pizza. "Why are you really doing all this?" Eleanor asked quietly. The question that had hovered between them for months finally spoken aloud. Richard considered his answer carefully. "At first it was guilt," he admitted. "I wanted to fix what my company had. Broken, but now... He looked around at the modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and carefully patched curtains. Now I'm here because this feels more like home than anywhere I've lived in 20 years. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. The girls have become attached to you. I've become attached to them too, Richard said, and to their aunt. The words hung in the air between them, too honest to take back, too new to fully explore. Eleanor looked down, but Richard saw the colour rise in her cheeks. It's been 3 years since Catherine died, she said finally. Some days I still expect her to walk through the door. Other days I feel guilty for continuing to live, for finding moments of happiness when she can't. Richard reached out tentatively, covering her hand with his. She would want you to be happy. She would want the girls to be happy. Eleanor didn't pull away. How do you know? Because she must have been like you, Richard said, and that's exactly what you would want. That night, walking back to his penthouse that no longer felt like home, Richard made a decision. The next morning he called a real estate agent and put the property on the market. Then he began looking for a house, a real home, with a yard for the girls to play in and enough room for a family that might someday include him. But the past wasn't finished with them yet. Just as their new life was taking shape, Harrington reappeared. Eleanor was walking the girls home from school when a luxury car pulled alongside them. The window lowered to reveal a face she had seen only in newspaper photos, the man who had killed her sister. "Mrs. Wilson," he said smoothly, "I think it's time we had a conversation about your arrangement with Richard Montgomery. Congratulations, type 9 in the comments so that I know you stayed until the end with me. Thank you for watching, and until tomorrow's story on this same channel."